role in prevention. So today we're going to talk about strategies for accessible and inclusive prevention. And I know we caveated and Tessa said, and will kind of reiterate that today is just we are scratching the surface. We are delighted to bring to you our panelists who have lived experience, are members of deaf and hard of hearing community. And just wanted to start the conversation about how in prevention, we can make our work accessible and be inclusive of everybody. And that really aligns with our theme of the month, which is preparing for Disability and Inclusion Month in March. So if we could get the next slide, Tessa. So just real quick before I turn it over, if you're not familiar or if this is the first time that you are joining us for Prevention Exchange, the Ohio Center of Excellence exists to really support the prevention workforce, to institutionalize core components of behavioral health prevention. We try to provide resources and frameworks of evidence-based practices to support the work. And then also we serve as a central access point for Ohio's prevention community and interested others. So thank you for joining us today. And Tessa, I'll kick it back to you.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Jen. I was trying to get our presentation to show in the correct format. So can you give me a thumbs up if you were seeing a slide presentation and no presenter notes? Wonderful. Thank you, guys. I'm so sorry about that. These things only happen after we hit record. Before that, everything was fine. I want to thank our panelists for joining us today. And first, I would like to provide some introductions. So today we're joined by Stephen Bright and Annie Welch. Stephen has been a lifelong native of Cincinnati and became deaf around the age of 3 when he contracted spinal meningitis, leading to ear nerve damage with hearing loss. Stephen's parents decided to learn sign language and use it to communicate with their son. And as he got older, his sister and brother came along as well. Stephen went to several public schools in Cincinnati, being mainstreamed with an interpreter for his classes. As he got ready for his junior year in high school, he transferred to St. Rita School for the Deaf in Cincinnati and graduated in 1992. Stephen stayed in Cincinnati to go to Cincinnati State and the University of Cincinnati for his medical engineering technology degrees. After being in his engineering job for over 15 years, Steve made a career change, transitioning to being an ASL teacher full-time at various colleges and universities in the Cincinnati and Dayton regions. In 2018, Steve became Assistant Director of Interpreting at Sorensen Video Relay in Cincinnati until 2022, and he moved on to become the CEO for the Deaf Community Resource Center in Dayton, Ohio. Sometimes the Deaf Community Resource Center is referred to as DCRC in Dayton. We also have Annie Welch with us today. Annie was born deaf into a hearing family and is a dedicated full-time faculty member at Northern Kentucky University, contributing to the American Sign Language and Deaf Studies minor program. Additionally, she serves as an adjunct instructor at Cincinnati State Technical and Community College and specializes in courses such as deafblind interpreting within the interpreter training program. Annie holds a BA degree from Wright State University, an MA degree from Gallaudet University, and recently earned a second master's in ASL teaching in December 2021. Prior to her career in ASL teaching, she amassed over a decade of experience in the mental health field, both as a direct service provider and as a coordinator for the deaf and deafblind communities. With over 25 years of experience in ASL instruction and mentoring, Annie has been deeply involved in the deafblind community, offering her expertise as a deaf interpreter and support service provider for more than 20 years. Can you join me in welcoming Steve and Annie to Prevention Exchange this month? Today we are going to Before I hand the presentation over, I am so sorry to cut you off. Before we hand the presentation over, I just want to remind you that our learning objectives today are to learn a little bit about the history of deaf culture. We want to understand the unique needs of the deaf community members and how to access interpreters and meaningful support in a timely manner, and discuss the opportunity for Ohio's prevention workforce to provide more inclusive prevention services. I'm going to hand this over to Annie and Steve now, so we can hear directly about their own experiences and learn from their knowledge in this space. We'll have some time for some independent conversation where we can apply some of our own learning, and then we'll come back together to learn, to discuss together what we've learned. So let me hand it over to you, Steve and Annie. I'm going to mute myself, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to learn from you.
Annie says, thank you so much. And Steve saying, thank you, Tessa, and thank you everybody for joining us today. We are both so thrilled to be here and to be a part of such an important discussion related to prevention. And hopefully we can give you just a few tidbits on what to do as far as inclusion specifically for the deaf community, deaf-blind community, and hard of hearing community. So, because, this is typically an overlooked minority that not many people think about. And so today I'm hoping that with what I talk about, we can provide a little bit of education to you. If you don't mind, next slide, please. Okay, so the Deaf Community Resource Center, we focus on birth through basically the rest of their lives for a variety of different resources. Whatever needs are needed to be met, we try to accommodate, just to help deaf to learn how to live independently and how to interact in the real world. We have a link on Facebook and also Twitter website that you can look at, dcrcohio.org. And we also provide ASL classes to the community and deaf culture classes. So we will discuss a little bit more about that as we move on in our presentation. Okay, next slide, please. So you've already learned from Annie and I a little bit about our biographies to let you know that yes, we are deaf, but with our families being hearing, that tells you a little bit more about this fun fact. So we're wondering what percentage of families do you think are born into hearing families? What percentage of deaf do you think are born into hearing families? And when you think of that, it's typically 90%. And you want to think about the effects that that will have on a person's mental health as well. And if Annie, if you don't mind to add to that. And Annie is saying, the thing is, and this, it was not included into my bio, but Steve being born as a hearing person. Oh, hold on one second. We're kind of switching around. Go ahead, Annie. Thank you so much. So Steve being born to hearing parents, his family had no background on deafness, no knowledge on sign language or any of those things. However, for myself, I was born to hearing parents, but my grandparents were deaf. So my mother already had ASL knowledge, awareness on deafness, and what that meant. So I was born into a family that happened to already know ASL. Half of my family was fluent in sign, while the other half of it at least had a bit of a knowledge when it came to deaf culture and not necessarily sign fluency. So that's something to think about as we discuss today. Steve's saying, I also wanted to add that one of the benefits from that relationship as well, because my parents were not sure how to get an interpreter. And they didn't know what to do within a mainstream setting. And Annie was actually one of the first people in Cincinnati who had been through that. And so I was able to benefit from her experience, which is really cool. Annie says it's a very small world, a small deaf community. And so, absolutely. Next slide, please. Thank you, Steve. So Annie's saying, when you think about culture in general, this is a pretty clear definition as to what that works. This is a great explanation, explaining culture to us as a whole, correct? It involves language, traditions, art, food, social interactions, values, all of those things that seem very normal when discussing culture. However, when it comes to deaf culture, it's not always the same. Many people do not realize that the deaf community has our own culture. So if you'll go to the next slide, I'll explain the definition of the deaf culture. So it's a pretty long definition, and I will be sure to share the PowerPoint with you. I can email that to you later, but just to give you a summary of what this talks about, just regarding specifics regarding deaf culture, the fact that we value and cherish our language, our access through sign language, the traditions and customs, behaviors, and experience that's all encompassing within the deaf community. Deaf culture and language, the language of ASL being our primary mode of communication, is not something that you can separate. Those two go hand in hand. And so to have a true understanding of American Sign Language, you have to have a true understanding of the deaf culture as well, because it's all encompassing. So I'll give you a second if you'd like to just read through that. But as I mentioned, as we talked about before, we can sum it all up in less than an hour. So if you'd like to go to the next slide, please. There is such a rich history included in our deaf culture, including within the deaf community. The first deaf school was founded in Hartford, Connecticut. That was the first deaf school back in the 1800s. It had such a huge milestone for the community. It was one of the first steps in acknowledging deaf education. The first development of ASL. That is a huge part of our history. When you talk about the development of ASL as a whole, it was never recognized as a language for many years. And then finally, they began to recognize that it was its own language. The communication had expanded, the ability to be able to use it was really huge. It was finally accepted as the language for the deaf community and gained the respect that it deserved. ASL is its own language. It has its own grammar, its own linguistical rules. It is not the same as English. ASL and English are not synonymous. It has its own structure, its own grammar that supports the deaf community. We're going to switch interpreters. We can hold 1 second.
Wow, that was a quick 15 minutes. Okay. Okay, yeah. So interpreters typically switch every 15 minutes, and I didn't realize time was going by so quickly. Okay, so talking about DPN, Deaf President Now, it's one of my favorite parts of deaf history. DPN, it was a protest back in 1988. And what happened was, for many years, Gallaudet University. Now, Gallaudet University is based in Washington, D.C. It is the only liberal arts deaf college in America, in the entire world. So imagine, you should think that the president of that university should be aware of sign language, deaf culture, deaf history, but it wasn't. For many, many years, it was always a hearing president. And so in 1988, the students there felt like, you know what, enough is enough. We need to have a deaf president. We need someone that understands our language, our culture, our community. And so we need someone who can better represent us, which would be someone who better understands us. And so in 1988, there was a huge protest. Because of that protest, they finally elected a deaf president, which was I. King Jordan. And he became the first deaf president of Gallaudet University. And since 1988, every president since has been deaf. So every president since that protest has been deaf. The reason that is such an important thing is because the world was involved in that protest. It was hugely televised, newspapers, media outlets. It was shown everywhere. There was a lot of collaboration with other organizations, other minority groups. Also, the hearing culture was involved in supporting that protest and really recognizing deaf leaders. And it was just such a unique protest. It was really one of a kind. And so thinking of it was such a huge part of the deaf culture, thinking of liberal arts and really representing who we were and the language. We had poets, we had visual arts, performances, theatrical and performances, movies, everything was really, a huge synopsis of who we were as a deaf culture. Now, looking at legal rights and advocacy, you will notice the ADA, which is Americans with Disability Act, which passed in 1990. There were deaf community. There was a huge part of that as far as the planning and organizing of that. So the ADA, Americans with Disability Act, does not only focus on the deaf community only. It focuses on Americans with disabilities in general. It did have a huge impact on the deaf community as far as their rights, their feeling of inclusion, their feeling of equity. So I feel it was a huge part of my life, seeing that shift and that change from when I was growing up pre-ADA compared to post-ADA, and how much more I was included in things. Cultural identity and pride is extremely imperative. It is something that we don't want sympathy. We don't want your pity. Oh, the poor deaf community. No, we are proud of who we are. We are proud to be deaf. We value and cherish ASL and the deaf community. We respect and cherish ASL. It's what we used. We are not ashamed. We don't feel the need to hide. We are not embarrassed to be deaf. We are proud to show our deafness. We are not something that needs to be fixed. We are proud and we accept our deafness. We accept our identity as a deaf person. So all of those things really are a huge part of deaf culture. I mean, we could go on and on and on about all of this, but unfortunately, we don't have the time to do that today. So next slide, please. Now, kind of switching gears a little bit and focusing on effective communication, ensuring effective communication, access for the deaf community. So you first have to understand the deaf community, their experiences, their culture, and respect that, and also respect their needs and their need to be involved and a part of, and equality. So first, communication access. So the knowledge of communication access is so important for us to be included and for us to be aware of what's going on, whether that be sign language, the use of technology, any mode of communication, whatever that deaf person's preference is. It may not always be American Sign Language. They may use other tools as long as they have that access to communication. Now, as far as interpreting services are concerned, providing access, which would mean qualified quality interpreting to facilitate communication between the deaf and the hearing communities effectively. So I want to make sure that we are very clear. It is not only the deaf community that need the interpreters. Hearing people do not understand the ASL, so they are equally in need of the interpreting services. It's a team effort. It's a team collaboration of making sure that that communication is effective. Now, as far as interpreting qualifications, not every interpreter is perfect. There are signers. There are people who just know sign language. They're learning sign language. They haven't been formally trained as ASL interpreters. Maybe that's their goal. And so you need to have appropriate, qualified, certified, if it needs to be, that can, someone who is aware of deaf culture and someone who can facilitate that communication effectively. Timely response. As soon as you get an interpreting request, you should immediately send over that request and make sure that the interpreter is scheduled. If you postpone or you procrastinate and you push that off, you may not be able to get an interpreter. And even if you do, they may not be the best fit for that deaf consumer. And they may need specific training to accommodate that specific assignment. So as soon as you get that request, I really encourage you to send that request over to the agency or wherever you're getting that interpreter from to ensure that that interpreter is a good fit. Now, technology and remote interpreting. Technology is amazing. We all know that, and it is ever evolving quickly. There are some pros, but there are also cons to that as well. The pros being, maybe in a rural kind of country area, maybe they don't have access to live interpreters. They may need to use technology or remote interpreters where you can kind of bring up an interpreter on a screen if that's the need. But don't make that a habit of thinking that that will work for everyone. So for example, maybe I have a deaf blind consumer. Oh, maybe they have a very limited field of vision. Maybe they can't see the maybe they need an interpreter because they can't see the interpreter on the screen. Maybe technology, we know, is not always our best friend. There's a lot of times where things are freezing, causes a lot of frustrations, and may cause a lot of communication gaps. Maybe that area doesn't have really strong Wi-Fi or internet. If it does, great. If not, so technology may not always be the answer. So that's where it is really imperative that you bring in a live interpreter. Now, cultural competencies, being aware of the deaf community, the culture, the language, their traditions, and being respectful of that. That is what makes communication effective. Community resources. We're going to pass it off to Steve. He'll go a little bit more in depth about community resources, but partnering with a deaf organization that can really provide you with those resources, provide you with tools and things like that, making sure that you are doing your homework and really partnering with the appropriate organizations and making sure that it's inclusive. Making sure that equality is always there, making sure that the advocacy tool is there. Now, accessibility to policies and trainings. A lot of organizations out there, agencies out there, don't always have established policies and trainings. If you do, that's great. If not, then I encourage you to do so. Oftentimes, a deaf consumer will go in for an appointment and they'll say, I need an interpreter. And a lot of times that agency or organization's like, I don't know who to contact. Are you going to bring your own interpreter? Maybe you know how to contact an interpreting agency. And the deaf person is like, here we go again. I have to come in and I have to help. And now it's just become a burden on the deaf community. It's nice to have that policy and trainings already established, making sure that your staff is aware of how to request interpreters. What interpreters are the most appropriate fit for the situation. So for example, now, as far as interpreter qualifications, not all interpreters are certified, RID certified. I mean, if they are, that's great, but they may not always be a great fit for mental health appointments. Mental health has very specific trainings for interpreters to make sure that they are aware of how to facilitate that communication and that kind of facilitating those conversations back and forth regarding mental health. Okay, so if we could go on to the next slide. Oh, okay, so I'm so happy that Annie is with us. Annie is very well versed in mental health. She has a lot of knowledge. She is a huge benefit and an asset for us in that way. Okay, is it my turn? All right, going on to the next slide, please. So as Annie had just mentioned, she just touched on 2 key points. One being community resources. So we will talk about that a little more after the breakout sessions. And then accessibility, policies and trainings. What does that look like? So if you want to discuss, maybe that's something you guys can discuss during the breakout groups. I think these 3 points will really kind of help guide some good, thoughtful conversations. If a deaf person, so like Annie had mentioned, happens to come into your place of work, your business, maybe they had gotten a referral, maybe you can help me. And you're like, I don't know. I don't know what to do. I don't know what the next step is. How do we handle these sort of situations? What are your concerns working with someone with a hearing loss, with the deaf community? Think about that. Throw out some ideas. These are things that need to be addressed. Then we will be able to share some tips with you. The third point, what opportunities do you see for being more inclusive in your planning process? What does that look like? How can we really set that foundation and set that structure for making sure that you're ready for the next time that something may pop up? Okay, so I think we are now ready to go into the breakout rooms. Hope you guys have good discussions.
All right, thank you so much. So we are going to open up the breakout rooms now. I've stopped sharing. What we're going to do is we're going to repost those questions in the chat so you will be able to access them. I'm going to open the breakout rooms. We ask that you join them if you have any questions. We will be in the main room. You're welcome to pop out and ask us some questions. We're going to set a timer for about 9 minutes. That way you've got enough time to ask some questions. If you need more time for your conversation, please let us know. Well, we can add, we have a little bit of time, but not a whole lot. So let me get these breakout rooms opened. Okay, you should. Are you seeing an invitation to join a breakout room? We'll try it one more time. Hold on, guys. There was an update. Assign automatically. Okay. All right. You should be getting an invitation now to join your breakout room. If you do not see the invitation for your breakout room, please feel free to share it in the chat or unmute and share with us your struggles.
Hey, Tessa, really quick, Steve's asking, do you want him and Annie to join a breakout room or no?
They don't have to. If they would like to join a breakout room, they're welcome to. They're also welcome to stay in here.
Is anyone in room 3?
Let's take a look.
Anyone from the audience in room 3?
We have 1, 2, 3. We have 3 people in breakout room.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's best for them to just kind of have that opened up. Yeah. Yeah. And this is also it's also part of the recording.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're gonna pause our recording now.
So could you do again,
Thanks,
please?
Alika. What?
Could you do multi-pen again? Enable
Oh,
that. Mind.
darn it. Thank you.
Yeah, Steve says, hold on, let me get situated here.
You should have multi-pen now.
Yep.
And let me get Krista multi-pen. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you had wonderful discussion. I'm going to before I hand this back to our presenters, was there anything that kind of like stood out to you? What was, tell us about your experience. You're welcome to unmute or put anything in the chat.
There is a man talking on the screen, but the microphone's muted. I can see, Annie says.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I apologize. My name is Vinny Riccardi, and I'm the executive director for Believe Center in Toledo, Ohio. And when I was talking in the chat with my group, I did share with the fact that I do have a sister-in-law and a sister that actually is deaf, but they live out of state. So I am not, when it comes to sign language, I'm an idiot, to quite confess. But I am cognizant of, making sure that you have availability of whatever services. But then coming to the reality is looking at my own agency is I quite honestly never ever thought that, I need to make sure that I have this put in place, which is, it is something. I know that I've never had to deal with it, but you need to make sure that you're ready for it and that the staff is prepared and competent. We work, as I was sharing with my group, that we work with a largely Hispanic population, so therefore everybody needs to be bilingual. So we make sure that that's put in place, but never thought about some other disabilities to be responsible of. You get spoiled with the tablet and you can, use a service to kind of, do whatever it is that you need to do. But I think I really need to not wait till we potentially get a person who just signs. So that is something that's on my list now to make sure that I get, an action plan put in place and make sure we have it all ready. So I have no concerns about working with anybody. I
think that's such a great idea to go ahead and be prepared. Both of them are saying.
Mm-hmm. And then opportunities for being more inclusive. Well, I think I pretty much just said that, making sure that we do put that in place and then make sure that staff is cognizant, respectful, which they are, but being able to realize, any of the disabilities that anybody has, which they pretty much do. And I do have a staff person who actually has already said that they would like to take the classes. So that would be a plus. Hope and pray that she gets that soon done. So that's what I had to say.
And it says, absolutely, that's great. And ASL is such a benefit to communicate with deaf just because it's our primary mode of communication.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, it benefits other people with disabilities as well that do use ASL to communicate. So you never know who ASL will benefit. You really never know. I think that's wonderful.
Thank you.
Sure.
Our group actually brought up a really great point.
Also in the chat as well. I think. Oh, sorry, this is the interpreter. Tessa, I lost that multi-pen again, if you don't mind.
Oh, darn it. Okay, Zoom is messing with us today. I am so sorry. Oh,
Here, while Zoom, while we fix the multi-pen, and I had to ask before the session what multi-pen was, but It is a way to bring our interpreters and Annie and Steven's faces larger into a box for the interpreters so they can see in better signs. So actually, Jen,
And that's for anybody who doesn't have their screen off. It will show.
Yeah.
thank you for clarifying. I was just going to ask if I explained that poorly. If you want to clarify.
No problem. That's perfect.
Sure. My
Thank you.
other comment I was going to put in the chat. If you are not seeing
And
your,
it says that people that don't have the camera on it will automatically hide. So I do have that.
got it. Thank you. If you are not seeing your name in the tile box and it's been replaced with Sarah Sipus, if you would kindly just send me a private message with your name so we can record your attendance, that would be wonderful. And hopefully at this point, we're ready to resume our show.
I think we are. So you should be able to multi-pin now.
Yep, we are good to go. Thank you so much. And we're switching interpreters before we start.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'd love to make sure Steve has enough time to complete what he had outlined to share. So,
Well, hold on. Annie's asking Steve if he planned on answering a question that was in the chat. She just said, I just make sure that everybody's questions are answered and that everybody is good.
thank you. I can't see the chat when I'm sharing, so I appreciate you letting me know there was a question there.
Okay. Okay, so are we good to keep going then? Are we good to move on? Or are we still going to talk about what was discussed during the breakouts?
I think we're gonna move just now to let Steve finish what he was gonna present. We can come back to the breakout at the end when we talk about our aha moments. So thank you everyone for sharing your insight so far. I just want to make sure we have enough time for the rest of Steve and Annie's presentation.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the next slide then. Okay, so I think someone in the chat had asked about interpreters. I guess that was a big discussion that had came up during their breakout. So Annie had already kind of talked about it a little bit, and I'm going to go a little bit more in depth with it. So who uses interpreters? So like Annie had mentioned, yes, the deaf person needs the interpreter, but also the hearing person because they don't sign. So everyone who needs that to have effective communication is relying on that interpreter. Okay, so it's important to have interpreters to facilitate the conversation both ways. Next, interpreters versus signers. Again, as Annie had mentioned, a signer is someone who's still learning. They may know the basics, but definitely not well enough to be a qualified interpreter. They are definitely not qualified to be put in situations where interpreting would be required. A lot of times information will be missing. So typically an interpreter training program is about 2 years. They get a degree and they're typically qualified enough, but it definitely needs someone, preferably to have a bachelor's degree, a 4-year. We do have programs across Ohio that has interpreter training programs, different colleges and universities all over Ohio. So there's definitely options there. Once someone goes through the program, they learn about the code of ethics. It's called the CPC, and that is under RID, which is the Registry for Interpreters of the Deaf, which is really imperative because going through the program and learning all of that, and then when they take their certification test, those are things that are kind of need to be known as far as the code of ethics, which then goes into confidentiality, which is extremely important in the field of interpreting. everything must remain confidential. Everything that happens at any sort of setting needs to remain confidential. Annie would like to add something onto that. Annie's saying, I just want to emphasize the importance of confidentiality, especially within the deaf community. The deaf community is part of a minority group. Once trust is broken, then you're done. Like there is no bringing that back. Because that's why we so much emphasize the importance of confidentiality. We share so much and a lot of times very private information during some of these importance. And that's why it is so important for us to be able to trust the interpreting community. The deaf community is so very small, Steve is saying. And so rumors and word get spread around very, very quickly. Yeah. You think Twitter is bad? I guarantee you we're faster. I guarantee you. The way that we spread information within the deaf community, and now that we've got social media, it's even worse. So when you try to request an interpreter, who's responsible for requesting that interpreter? So that is where you'll see the deaf person come in and say, hey, I was referred to you for whatever, a consultation or a variety of different reasons, whatever the reason may be that they were referred to you. So then what do you do about that? How do you request an interpreter? I'm going to show you that on the next slide. But who pays for the interpreter? So as Annie had mentioned, the ADA, interpreting is covered under the ADA, and the laws state who is responsible to provide that interpreter and to pay for that interpreter. It is the agency or the doctor's office or the organization that is responsible to cover the cost and request an interpreter. And this is Annie. Do not ask family members to interpret. Do not ask a deaf person to bring a volunteer interpreter. That is in violation of the ADA. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Here's a list of interpreting agencies just for reference. This is not a complete list of agencies. These are just ones that I'm familiar with. Maybe your area doesn't have one. Maybe you can research online, but this is just a few that I am familiar with. So the last one has community services for the deaf agent. Oh yeah, so this last line has community services for the deaf that are all over Ohio. So you can reach out and almost all of them have interpreters or connections with interpreting agencies. Or you could always reach out to us, DCRC. We're more than happy to help you kind of navigate that and figure out what interpreting agencies or interpreters are in your area. Okay, hold on. Let me check the chat really quick because I think there was a question. Okay, so there's a question related to there's a question related to what kind of centers or facilities will help with can help with peers who are blind. There is a blind school. Annie is saying there's a blind school. It's the Ohio School for the Blind. They may have different resources available there that may help benefit you in that way. If you don't feel like you're getting adequate information, then you could always reach out to DCRC and they'd be able to, again, help you kind of navigate that. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. Okay, so tips for communication. If you were to encounter a deaf person, be flexible, be creative. Writing back and forth is an option for some deaf people. Some deaf people can communicate in that way. Don't be afraid to, yes, text, use your phone. That's an option. And now a lot of the phones have voice to text. So you can just speak your message and the deaf person would be able to read it and then text back in response. That may be an option. Again, be creative. Now, Annie is saying, first, what's really first impressions are important. So make sure that you're friendly. If you are frozen like a deer in headlights and you act like you do not know what to do, the deaf person will lose patience with you rather quickly. Now, some deaf people are like, okay, I get it. We'll work this out. And some deaf people are like, forget it. Here we go again. So, and of course, you know, the deaf community, it varies, but okay, and also want to give you a really quick story, Steve is saying. So back in the day, we were at a fast food restaurant. We had gone in, hadn't written out my order yet. And so I had gone up to the front and I started to write down my order. And then when I looked up to the person, the manager started pointing. And I was like, what are we pointing at? I'm confused. I didn't understand. And so then the worker came up and they wrote and they said, hey, the other store was just robbed by someone who wrote a note. And so they had written a note that said, give me your money. And so ever since then, I make sure that I have my note ready, ready to go. Because like I said, I guess another restaurant had just been kind of robbed and somebody had written a note. So they were a little nervous. So we are deaf. And so therefore our vision is, you know, very sensitive. And so we see a lot of what's going on. So again, don't be afraid of facial expressions, body language, body movement, gestures, those kind of things, points, made people like, you know, all of the, yes, it was kind of scary. Absolutely. So make sure that you are patient, you are calm. Make sure that you are aware of like lighting, background lights, if things are really bright. If you have a lot of facial hair, things like that, it can make communication very difficult. Some deaf people are good at lip reading, but do not assume that. Only about 30% are actually good at lip reading. Some aren't at all. Some absolutely can't or refuse. So it just really varies. Annie, did you want to add anything else? Annie says, nope. Nope, I'm good. Okay, so another tool that you can use is the state government has like a communication card for if a deaf person were to get pulled over by law enforcement. It may be useful, maybe something interested. If you're interested in that, please let me know and I can get some cards made up for you guys if you would like that. Okay, I think we're good. Move on to the next. Okay.
Wonderful. I want to thank.
Wait, hold on just one second. So Annie is just saying, we really wish we had more time to cover everything, but we are really trying to focus on, you know, just some really important kind of bullet points. But thank you guys all so much.
Yes. Thank you to Annie and Steve. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see. I'm so sorry. I hope you're not signing and I'm missing.
Oh, do you mind going? Oh, sorry. There was one more slide. Do you mind going back?
Of course.
Oh, yes. So I wanted to make sure that we shared that QR code. If you wanted to access any of our information, you're able to do that. And like Annie said, we can provide the slides to you. Tessa, would you be able to send those slides out?
Yes, absolutely. We can make sure that these get to folks.
Great. Thank you so much. Both are saying thank you. And Steve saying thank you so much for inviting us to be here today. We really enjoyed our time with you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Someone asked a question, actually, if we could see that real quick in the chat.
Yes, thank you. I just want to say thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll answer questions now. I do want to honor that we're at the 2 o'clock hour. So if folks need to go, please go ahead and hop, but want to make sure if you have a question, you're welcome to stay.
And Steve saying to answer the question in the chat, regarding first responders, yes, actually, we have been working on providing trainings for first responders and are more than willing to do that. I know that we've done it for the Dayton Police Department, regarding accessibility and that conversation and what it looks like. We do like a deaf culture, a 101, like Deaf 101, a 2-hour course, if that's something you're interested in. And Steve saying, yes, with COVID, that is a great question. And Annie says, oh my goodness, those masks, ooh, they're absolutely terrible, especially because they cover the whole part, like the whole bottom part of your face. So we're so dependent on facial expressions. I'm like, are they talking to me? Who are they looking at? Like, what is going on? That was such a rough experience for deaf. And for myself as an ASL professor, I really experienced that when we went back on campus with my students. We're in the classroom and I'm teaching. And at that time, masks were still required on campus. And it was so hard for me to navigate. It really impacted my mental health when I look back on it, the anxiety that it gave me, not really, people not understanding the added barriers. So I am so glad that masks are a part of the past for now. And Steve saying, and to add to what Annie said, I used to work at Sorensen Video Relay Service, and typically interpreters would come into the office, into the call center. And when COVID hit, it changed everything. The majority of the interpreters are working remotely, and they are still working remotely. And so there's no face-to-face interaction with them if they need something. And that's been much harder for them. It's been much harder for me to be able to work with them. It was tough. And Annie and Steve is saying, yes, the clear masks were a little more helpful. And Annie saying, again, that depends on the lighting just because of glares. And Steve saying, just like I mentioned, the facial expressions are important. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Absolutely.
Does anybody else have any questions or comments?
Gosh, I know there's just
Well, Steve says, if something comes up later, feel free to email or anything like that. You are welcome to reach out.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I know there are just a few folks that are able to hang with us for a few minutes past. And I don't think anybody wanted this session to end, and we all recognize that there's so much more work to do. So Annie, Steve, Jen, and where did
Krista, yes.
Krista go? I wanted to say Tessa. But thank you so much for joining us.
Everyone. And Steve and Annie are saying, yes, thank you everyone so much for everything, and the interpreters for a job well done. Steve saying, have a great weekend. And Annie saying, yes, everyone have a great weekend as well. And I've got to jump into another meeting. So thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you. I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.